This is a story of spies, and it's a story of deception. This is a story of real and fake identities that mix together. This is a story of marital betrayals before national ones. This is a story of espionage, of stealing secrets. And above all, it's an incredible story. A story of a man who manages to pretend to be what he is not and to be accepted by pretending to be what he is not. It's a story of a man who changes his identity, a man who, to serve his country, not the one he was born in, the one that welcomes him, raises him, recognizes him, he ends up doing anything, even denying his own loved ones. This story belongs in the movies. Maybe it'll be a film someday. Meanwhile, this is a true story about Wolfgang Lotz, a Yeki in Cairo, the most incredible spy the Israeli intelligence services have ever had. Do you know why I call him the most incredible spy the Israelis have ever had? For a very simple reason. Wolfgang Lotz, for a certain part of his life, managed to pretend to be a former Wehrmacht officer. You might say the last name, Lotz, and first name, Wolfgang, are German. Yes, that's correct. Wolfgang Lotz was a Yeke, that is, a Jew who grew up in German society. He was born in Germany before the rise of Adolf Hitler. Haim, son of a Jewish woman, Helene, and a Gentile, that is, a non-Jewish German, Hans Lotz, a theater director. His family was quite a peculiar one because neither of his parents cared much about religious education. That's why not only did Wolfgang Lotz not attend either church or synagogue, but he wasn't even circumcised. His mother didn't want it. And this little detail would be extremely helpful many years later for his career as a spy. An uncircumcised Jew is a rarity. It's the classic white crow. But if for a long time the supposed proof of being Jewish was circumcision, well, Wolfgang could easily bypass these checks. The Lotz family saw their outlook on life change radically in the 1930s. In 1931, Wolfgang's parents, Hans and Helene, divorced. 2 years later, Hitler rose to power, and difficulties started with the introduction of the Nuremberg laws. But for the moment, they don't affect little Wolfgang or his mother, because they are obviously divorced. They live far from Wolfgang's biological father. But then, the situation starts to get heavier and heavier. The first persecutions, arrests, and violence begin. And it's at that moment, in 1937, a year before Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, that Helene decides to take little Wolfgang with her to Palestine. It's the period of so-called freedom, that is, the return of many Jews who flee from Europe even before the outbreak of the Second World War, toward a new homeland, a land of hope. We've discussed the British Mandate of Palestine in other videos on the channel, but in that period, Palestine represented a promised land and also an opportunity for a new beginning. At 16, Wolfgang arrives in Palestine, marking his first major transformation. He even changes his name. He no longer wants to be called by that German name. He doesn't like it. He decides to call himself Zeev Guraria. That's his new name. That's how he's registered at the registry office. With that name, he joins the Haganah, the first self-defense forces of the future state of Israel. Wolfgang decides to commit himself to ensuring the safety not only of his mother, but also of the other settlers living in the first kibbutzim. Moreover, in the 1930s, during the tumultuous years of the Palestine Mandate, there were some pogroms that were essentially instigated by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. We've already talked about him in another video that you can find on the Wolfgang channel. Zeev trains with weapons and becomes a skilled fighter. But then war breaks out in Europe. In 1939, he, registered as a resident in Palestine, is called to arms as a subject of the British Empire. He is no longer a German citizen. He is recruited by the Royal Army and initially sent to Egypt. And it is precisely in Egypt that he puts one of his characteristics to good use, the ability to speak excellent German. Starting from February 1941 in North Africa, the troops of what would become the famous Deutsches Afrika Korps, and later the Panzer Army Africa, began to arrive. They are Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's soldiers. We've already talked about him. You can find a short, multi-part monograph about him on the channel. Enjoy it. The linguistic talent of Zeev, or Wolfgang, whichever you prefer to call him, emerges at that moment, because every time German soldiers are captured during battles in Libya or Egypt, they are first taken to Alexandria and then to Cairo for interrogation. And as an interpreter, often and willingly, there's that guy born in Mannheim who speaks excellent German. Through those interrogations, Wolfgang or Zeev, whichever you prefer, not only does he make himself very useful to the British war effort, but he also starts to understand some little secrets of his former countrymen, from those who have become his enemies, who speak his same language. He starts to get details about their lives, their civilian lives, and he also begins to learn about the various units involved in the conflict at their disposal. And above all, those little things, the friendships that are born, the camaraderie, the details, the card games under the tents, the arguments, the friendships that arise, the quarrels, all the little details of other people's lives, which, well, will turn out to be even more useful to him. The war ends in 1940. Zeev is discharged and returns home, but he still feels the need to fight. Between 1948 and 1949, Israel fights its first war of independence. It's a bitter war. It's a very tough war. It's a war that sees atrocities on both sides, on the Israeli side and on the Arab side. It's a dirty war. Zeev Gurari now uses only that name, pursues a career in the Haganah and Israel Defense Forces, becomes a captain, and fights in the Latrun salient. He faces the worst, fights, survives, and is honored. But it doesn't end. Why? A few years later, when Britain and France proposed to Israel to attack Nasser's Egypt, which has occupied the Suez Canal, for a joint operation, Zeev Guraria is back in command, this time as a major. He advanced in his career, commanding an infantry battalion that assaulted the Sinai Peninsula and stood out there as well. But by the late 1950s, he changes and switches sides again. No longer a direct combatant, but a different kind of fighter. This is what Zeev Guraria becomes. He becomes a member of Aman, the Israeli Military Intelligence Service. For those who don't know, Israel has several intelligence services. People assume only the Mossad exists, which handles foreign intelligence, but that's not entirely true. Exactly, Mossad operates solely overseas, gathering intelligence and conducting disinformation operations abroad. Then there's Aman, the Military Intelligence Service. Here it closely involves the personnel, all members of the Israel Defense Forces gathering information, internal and external espionage, counter-espionage, and safeguarding military secrets. Then there's what is mistakenly called Shin Bet, but in reality it's called Shabak, the Sherut Bichon Klali, which is the Internal Security Service. This conducts counter-espionage and protects Israeli personalities inside and outside Israel. To give you an example, when Israeli sports teams go to play in various competitions internationally, for example, Maccabi Tel Aviv is like a small Israeli national team. Here are the people, well-dressed, elegant, with dark glasses and earpieces following them. They're not from Mossad, they're from Shabak. There's also one last office with a long, complicated name I won't repeat, which basically deals with countries that persecute Jews for ethnic or religious reasons. Well, as we were saying, Zeev Guraria gets himself transferred to Aman, and Aman takes advantage of him, taking advantage of his excellent skills as a soldier and his knowledge. For example, they send him to Europe, but why? Because Zeev is a Yeke, he is a Jew born and raised in Germany. He can become naturalized, he can blend in, he can build a useful background for other missions, pretend to be something he's not. It's a common technique in Israeli intelligence services, which can rely on a wide range, a broad array of solutions of people who can become English, American, Russian, Polish, German, Italian, Spanish, pretty much any Caucasian ethnicity. And in some cases, think of the Falasha, they can even impersonate African leaders. Zeev Gurari moves to France with his family for some time. His wife, an Israeli woman whom he married and is seriously in love with, also had children with him. Later, he moves to Germany. And while traveling to Germany, he meets another girl, A woman who is not Jewish, she's a German girl, Catholic. He falls in love with her. He reports this to his superiors, who at first are not exactly enthusiastic about his choice, but they understand him. In fact, they encourage him. They encourage him because they understand that the possibility of having a non-Jewish wife could be useful for his future cover during a mission to be carried out. The enemy territory chosen is Egypt. Egypt, starting from the mid-1950s, became a particularly hostile state toward Israel. The rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of the Free Officers, who overthrew King Farouk and transformed Egypt from a monarchy into a socialist-style republic. He elevated the land of the pharaohs to enemy number one of the state of Israel, along with Syria. Above all, Nasser, he spent large amounts of money to modernize his armed forces, to buy everything modern available on the market, mainly from one supplier, the Soviet Union or its satellites. Why is that? Why, after the Sinai War, Nasser not only no longer trusts the European powers that attacked him, but he positions himself as the main ally of the Soviet Union in the region. It's a very dangerous game, a game that's part of the Cold War. But the Soviets are not the only suppliers of weapons to Nasser. They are the main ones. They supply him with tanks, fighter jets, helicopters, modern artillery, and instructors. Something is still missing from Arsenal. We discussed this in another video on the channel. Missiles are missing, and Nasser wants medium and long-range ballistic missiles, but the Soviet Union refuses. At that time in history, they are not willing to provide that type of weapon to countries that are not directly controlled or subordinate to Moscow. Nasser is legitimate, and if not an ally, at least a valuable regional partner. However, he can't guarantee full political reliability, so Moscow declines. Still, Nasser persists. Someone in Cairo points out to him that, after all ballistic missiles are derived from the same prototype, the V-2, the missiles created by Wernher von Braun to destroy England during the war. All the other missiles in the world were derived from that prototype. Well, von Braun is not available. He was exfiltrated to the United States with Operation Paperclip at the end of the war, and he became the father of the Apollo space program. So there's no point in asking. But there are many other German scientists, some stayed in Germany, others in other parts of Europe. And maybe with some self-motivation, they could go back to working on the old 2 project and update them to the standards of the 60s. The one proposing this deal is Odessa. We've already come across it when we talked about this network of former Nazis on the run and some of its members. Find our videos on our channel. Odessa proposes to Nasser to build 300 missiles to strike Israel, because the war between Egypt and Israel, as we know, is inevitable. One day it will happen. We don't know when, but there's no point in having doubts or illusions. Eventually, another fight is inevitable. Nasser wants to be ready, even in tough situations. Even to be able to launch a first strike, a preemptive attack maybe, the same first strike that the Israelis have in mind. It's a chess game between Cairo and Tel Aviv, a very dangerous one, and a key pawn becomes him. Zev Gurari. Actually, Wolfgang Lotz, because he takes back his old name, is sent from Europe to Cairo with a fake identity. He reclaims his German name, but with entirely new documents. A totally different story. Lotz is no longer the son of a theater director and a Jew. No, he is a Jew. Actually, not even that. He is an Israeli. No, not even that. He is a pure-blooded German, born and raised in Germany, who served in the Wehrmacht during the war, specifically in North Africa. And after the war ended, he escaped to Australia, where he set up a writing school. And now he wants to bring that same school to Cairo. Imagine what a diabolical intrigue. A German Jew pretending not to be Jewish, that he has never been to Israel, that he was a soldier during World War II, specifically an officer that he fought, and now he's an entrepreneur in the field of horse riding. Incredible. Yet in Cairo, they fall for it. Everyone falls for it. The Egyptians fall for it, and so do several Germans who are already in Cairo, many of whom have a Nazi past. Wolfgang Lotz's writing club becomes the meeting point for some very lively evenings, with alcohol for the Germans, and of course orange juice for the Egyptians, who are observant Muslims. They discuss politics and they also talk about weapons. Lotz has been impeccably trained. He was also provided with a small wireless transmitter, which is hidden in the scale hanging in his bathroom. Every evening after those briefings that last a long time and end with toasts, some with champagne, some with cognac, and some, in his case, with orange juice, Lotz says goodbye to his guests. He says goodnight to his wife, then locks himself in the bathroom to message Tel Aviv. He does this for years because he believes in his country, Israel, not Germany, and wants to help. In a race against time, as shown during the Basel missile trial, the video is on the channel. Nasser's project is to create two missiles, the Al-Qaira and the Al-Zafira, that will strike Israel, with different ranges, some spreading bubonic plague, others irradiating the territory, with radioactive strontium-90. This is what comes out in the trials. Some historical sources will criticize the actual ability of the Egyptians to produce this type of warhead. But this is what comes out. It's clear that when they find out about these projects in Tel Aviv, which are about genocide, they decide to intervene. It's Isser Harel, the director of the Mossad, who pushes the OZ into a race against time to make the German scientists desist from continuing this kind of operation. The OZ, from that moment on, launches a terrorist campaign. They send several packages, all falsely addressed to Hamburg, to the various German scientists present in the area. Some are diffused. Others literally explode in the hands or faces of those who open them. One of them is an unfortunate German lady named Wenda Annelore, the secretary of one of the scientists employed. She will return home completely disfigured. Another package arrives at Base 333 in Elba, outside Cairo, industrial district. It's the security director who cuts the string of the package. He doesn't have time to open the wrapping. It explodes and kills 5 people, including guards and workers. That's enough to enrage the Egyptian secret services, who, from that moment, launch a manhunt. In Europe, even more so in Egypt, because they're convinced there's a mole, and they're right. Because, in fact, Wolfgang Lotz keeps putting his cover at risk, sending those packages until the scientists start leaving, one after another. But Lotz says it's ultimately an Israeli woman who ruins him. His name is Eli Cohen. He operates from Damascus and gets exposed by the Syrians. Cohen is caught while handling a wireless device identical to Lotz's, a device that is studied by Soviet military and intelligence advisors, and that leads those same advisors to Cairo with triangulation techniques to find out where the shortwave messages are being sent from. On February 22, 1965, the Egyptian police raid Wolfgang Lotz's writing club and begin the search. In the bathroom, inside the scale, they find that radio bug, but no one suspected him yet. Even the Egyptians are surprised and can't understand how it's possible. That man, that German, that Nazi, how could he be spying for the Israelis, Loth's wife? The second wife, the German woman, already knew her husband was a spy, but she was convinced he worked for NATO. And she herself tells the Egyptians that her husband is indeed a spy, but for the Western intelligence services. The Egyptians believe her. And when Lotz confesses to being a spy and working for the West, they still believe him. Even though they keep finding evidence of his involvement with Israel, these circumstances save Loth's life. Why? Well, simply, the Mossad pulls off another dramatic move. They manage to convince a cultural attaché from the West German embassy in Cairo to support someone who, after all, is one of their own countrymen. The trial of Wolfgang Lotz, who is beaten and tortured in prison anyway, is directly followed by lawyers sent from the German consulate. Some obstacles always have observers. This is the guarantee that Lotz and his wife will come out of this alive if it had been discovered that he was an Israeli spy. And both of them would have been brutally killed. Lotz is sentenced to life imprisonment. His wife gets 3 years, but she is released after less than a year. Of this life sentence, Wolfgang Lotz serves not even 3 years. In 1968, Israel organizes a prisoner exchange. Zev Guraria, by now we can call him by his real name, is exchanged once he is recognized by the Israelis themselves, with 300 Egyptian prisoners of war all captured during the Six-Day War. That Six-Day War in which Israel struck first, destroying on the ground the air fleets of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And that in just 6 days had destroyed the war machine of its opponents. Zev finally comes home for good. After some time, Loth's wife asks for a divorce. He later rebuilds his life in Israel and then Europe. His wife will die shortly after the divorce from coronary artery disease, a heart condition probably contracted in prison. Loth is already ill, though unaware. He will also die of a heart attack in 1993. In the meantime, he will build another life, once again. A life in Europe, in Munich, where, among other things, he publishes several books, including an autobiography, De Champagne Spy, The Champagne Spy. This is because he remembers his time in Cairo, the many late-night toasts with Egyptian officers and the Nazis who were on the run there. Wolfgang Lotz died in 1993 at the age of 72. He had refused Ariel Sharon's invitation sometime earlier to act as a guide for Western journalists in Lebanon. He no longer wanted that life, especially having to tell truths and lies at once. What he had seen and what he had experienced was enough for him. Behind him remains the funeral, with the military scents, the fanfare, the medals, the blank shots. But above all, behind him remains the memory of the most incredible spy ever seen in the Middle East. An uncircumcised Jew, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, who pretends to be a Nazi German. At one point in Cairo, there were even rumors he was an SS. He wasn't, of course. He was simply Wolfgang Lotz, the man who became Israel's most effective spy during Israel's most critical period. And he took advantage of the fact that he was not circumcised, that he had, let's say, Aryan features, and that he had obtained a lot of information about the North African campaign during the war, including the joking nicknames among the various German comrades, to pretend to be something he was not. Wolfgang Lotz is still remembered today in Israel as the best spy the Israeli services ever had. Cairo has a very different view, which is understandable and revealing. Sometimes in history, individuals appear who can pretend to be something they're not, but still manage to convince an incredible number of people. Lotz or Gurari, whatever you want to call him, he succeeded. He lived a very adventurous life, escaping from Germany, becoming a young soldier in Ghana, then World War II, then the wars in Israel, and finally espionage. He loved, had several wives, was unscrupulous, and enjoyed risk. And he had no regrets for what he did until the very end. But he kept in his heart, even though it was sick, the will to save as much as he could, as many human lives as possible, without denying what he has always believed himself to be, simply a Jew.